Hello and Grüß Gott to Berlin. I would love to be with you in Berlin right now, but I have to be in school in Bavaria. But some of my friends are gonna be or are with you right now. Thank you for organizing a symposium towards sustainable childhood, because we children think sustainability is the core for our future. But what is sustainability? Just about a year back, we talked to one of the indigenous people from North America, and he told us that in their village, every time they make a decision, they first think of even the seventh generation after them would support this decision, and only then they make it. And the name sustainability originally comes from the foresters, because they plant trees all their lives, although they themselves don't have a benefit from it, but their generations after them live from the trees they have planted. And next year, it will be 300 years of the name sustainability. But today, we have companies that talk about sustainability all the time and write it everywhere just to sell even more products. We children think that on income that isn't 100% sustainable, there should be 100% tax on it. And just a few months back, the adults celebrated sustainability. They celebrated 20 years of sustainability at the Rio Plus 20 conference. But we the children didn't understand why. We didn't think there was anything to celebrate. 20 years back at the first sustainability conference in Rio, there was a girl speaking there. She was called Severin Suzuki. But all she said 20 years back could have been repeated at the conference this year, because in these 20 years, nearly nothing happened. But in the last years, since there's YouTube, in the last 20 years, she got 20 million clicks on YouTube. But today, there are people with similar topics that managed to get 20 million clicks in 2 days on YouTube. And that gives us hope. Through the internet, we can work together and we can be powerful. Because we children, we see one main problem. In a few years, when we are in power and when we will have to live with all the problems the adults are not solving today, we won't be able to take the adults to account for the problems they haven't solved, as they will be dead by then. And if this wasn't the case, most adults will probably act quite differently. And we children, we also see two main crises: the poverty crisis and the climate crisis. The poverty crisis, with 30,000 people, mainly children, dying of starvation every single day, and 1/2 of the world's population living with less than $2 a day, and all of that in an incredibly rich world. And the climate crisis. Every day we take as much carbon, oil, gas and coal out of the ground as it took 1 million days for the sun to store it there. And we children understand that the adults know these crises, and not just since a short time, but since decades. Since 40 years since the Club of Rome report the limits of growth, or at least since 20 years since the first sustainability conference. But we children, we don't understand why there is so little action. Is it to do with the meaning of future? It seems for most adults, future means 20, 30 or even 40 years. But for many of us children, 2100 is still in our lifetime. So it's an academic question for the adults. If the sea level will rise by 1, 2 or 3 centimeters or 7 meters. But for many of us children, it's a question of survival. And if you let a monkey choose if he wants 1 banana now or 6 bananas later, then the monkey will always choose the 1 banana now. And it seems that many adults think a little like these monkeys. And to us children, it also seems that 9/11 is the darkest day for most adults. At that terrible terrorist act, 3,000 people died. But every day, 30,000 people are dying of starvation. And for us children, 12/11 is the darkest day. At the last climate conference in Durban in South Africa, Because adults are discussing about our future at these climate conferences since 17 years. And in that most recent conference, there was a very simple goal. A follow-up protocol for the Kyoto Protocol, which ends this year. But instead of making a contract that starts next year, the government decided there should only be one in 2020. That means that in 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 and 19, all countries can exhaust unlimited amount of CO2. And that means that the 2 degrees goal the adults are promising us since decades, that the temperature won't rise by more than 2 degrees, is impossible to reach. But this goal is incredibly important. If the temperature rises by like 2.3, 2.4 degrees, then the Greenland ice will melt and the sea level will rise by 7 meters. And at our academies, we learn a very simple memory hook. If we don't want the temperature to rise by more than 2 degrees, we're only allowed to exhaust 2 tons of CO2 per person per year. And if we don't want the temperature to rise by more than 1.5 degrees, we're only allowed to exhaust 1.5 tons of CO2 per person per year. But today we're already at nearly 6 tons. And if we continue that way until 2020, until we have that contract, we might have set the stage for 5 degrees plus. But nobody knows what that means. But once, when it was 5 degrees colder, there were 2 kilometers of ice over us here. And at that last climate conference in Canada, in Durban, during a speech by the Canadian Environment Minister, 6 of us youth from Canada stood up and they turned around, and on the back it said, "Turn your back to Canada." They were immediately thrown out of the conference, and just a few days later, the Canadian Environment Minister arrives home and announces that Canada will step out of the Kyoto Protocol. It's the only contract we have, but Canada just steps out of it short before it ends. Because when signing the contract they signed, they will reduce the emissions by 6%. But instead, they went up by 35%. And because of that, they should have paid a fine of $14 billion. But to save that money, they decided to step out of the Kyoto Protocol. Does that mean our future isn't even worth $14 billion? We children have understood we can't wait for the adults to solve these problems. We have to take our future in our own hands. So we children, we made a lot of consultations how we would save our future if we were the heads of governments of the world. The first point is, of course, planting trees. Our goal is to plant 1 trillion trees. If we plant these trees, they will absorb 1/3 of the human-made CO2 emissions. And 1 trillion trees also means 150 trees per person. And this is our goal. The second point is that by tree planting alone, we cannot solve these problems. We need to leave the fossil fuels in the ground. And this by 2050 by the latest. But the best part about this point is that all the technology we need for that already exists today. And the third point is that until that time, until 2050, until we leave the fossil fuels in the ground, there's only a limited amount of CO2 we're allowed to exhaust. That's what the scientists tell us. They tell us 1.5 tons of CO2 per person per year. And if someone wants to exhaust more, then they pay to the ones that exhaust less. But I think I've told you enough. My friends from Berlin will talk a little more soon. So, all the best for your meeting. Servus.